the little girl stopped her wheelchair beside the cafe table, looked directly at the tired-looking man sitting alone, and asked the one question that would change 3 lives forever. "Can we join you?" The man slowly lifted his eyes from his untouched coffee and stared at the child, then at the elegant woman standing several feet behind her. The woman looked like she had walked straight out of a business magazine. Mid-30s, perfectly dressed in a soft ivory blazer, expensive handbag hanging from her wrist, dark hair neatly tied back, and the unmistakable confidence of someone who was used to having entire rooms fall silent when she entered. But at that moment, there was no confidence in her eyes. There was only shock. Her daughter, Grace, was 7 years old and had never approached a stranger like this before. She had never asked to sit at another person's table. And the single dad sitting in front of her had no idea that the little girl's innocent question was about to reopen a wound he had spent years trying to bury. He looked at Grace's hopeful face, noticed the wheelchair beneath her, and then said something so unexpected that the woman behind her forgot how to breathe. "Before we continue, if you believe that kindness can give someone a second chance, that one small act can change a person's life, and that sometimes the people we meet by accident are the people we were meant to find, take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who believes in kindness, and subscribe to Second Chance Stories. Your support helps us bring more emotional stories like this to you." It was a bright Saturday morning in Millhaven, the kind of morning when sunlight poured through the tall glass windows of a small corner cafe called the Amber Spoon and painted golden patterns across the wooden floor. Outside, people hurried along the sidewalks with coffee cups in their hands, cars moved slowly through the weekend traffic, and a cool breeze stirred the green leaves of the trees lining the street. Inside, the cafe was warm, peaceful, and filled with the soft sounds of conversation, clinking cups, and quiet music. Near the window sat a man named Marcus Reed, 38 years old, broad-shouldered, slightly tired, with dark hair that had begun to show a few strands of gray near his temples. He wore a simple gray sweater and jeans, nothing expensive, nothing designed to attract attention. There was an old leather watch on his wrist and a folded piece of paper beside his coffee. He had been staring at that paper for almost 20 minutes without reading it. It was a rejection letter from a company where he had applied for a management position 3 weeks earlier. Another opportunity gone. Another door closed. Another reminder that starting over at 38 was much harder than he had imagined. Marcus was a single father, but he rarely told people that immediately. He did not like the sympathetic looks that followed. He did not like when strangers asked where his wife was, and he especially hated explaining that his wife had died 4 years earlier after a sudden illness that had turned an ordinary Tuesday into the worst day of his life. He had been left with a 5-year-old daughter, a small apartment, a mountain of bills, and a heart that had forgotten how to imagine a future. His daughter, Sophie, was the reason he had kept moving. Every morning, he had gotten out of bed because she needed breakfast. Every evening, he had gone to work because she needed a home. Every night, when she fell asleep, he had sat beside her bed and quietly promised himself that he would somehow make everything okay. But lately, making everything okay had become harder. Marcus had worked for years as a project supervisor at a construction company. He had been good at his job. Dependable and organized, the kind of man who stayed late when something went wrong and showed up early when everyone else was still sleeping. But after his wife died, he had taken a year away from work to care for Sophie, and when he returned, the company had already moved on without him. His career had never fully recovered. Now he was doing temporary work while searching for something permanent. Some months were manageable. Other months were a careful game of deciding which bill could wait another week. He had never complained about it in front of Sophie. He had learned how to smile when there was very little left in his bank account. He had learned that fatherhood sometimes meant pretending not to be afraid. That morning, however, Marcus had come to the cafe alone. Sophie was spending the day with his older sister, and for the first time in weeks, he had 2 quiet hours to himself. He had intended to use them to think about his future. Instead, he found himself staring through the window and wondering whether he had made too many mistakes to start again. He picked up his coffee, took a small sip, and looked at the rejection letter one more time. Then he folded it carefully and placed it in his pocket. He told himself it was only one rejection. But deep inside, he knew it was more than that. It was the fear that his life had become permanently smaller than the life he had once imagined. Across the cafe, the glass doors opened, and a woman entered with a little girl beside her. The woman was named Elena Whitfield. At 35, she was the CEO of one of the fastest-growing technology companies in Millhaven. Business magazines described her as brilliant, disciplined, ambitious, and almost impossible to intimidate. She had built her company from a small startup into a multi-million-dollar business before turning 35. Investors respected her. Employees feared disappointing her. Competitors studied her every move. Elena had spent most of her adult life proving that she could succeed without anyone's help. She had built walls around herself so high that even people who worked with her every day knew almost nothing about what happened behind them. But the little girl beside her knew everything. Grace Whitfield was 7 years old with long brown hair, curious hazel eyes, and a gentle smile that made people instinctively soften when they saw her. She had been born with a condition that affected her ability to walk, and she had used a wheelchair since she was very young. Elena never allowed anyone to describe Grace as helpless. She had spent years making sure her daughter had the best education, the best equipment, the best specialists, and every opportunity money could provide. But there was one thing Elena could not buy for her daughter. She could not buy the ordinary childhood moments that other children experienced without thinking about them. Grace could not simply run across a playground. She could not race her friends down a hallway. She could not climb onto a swing without assistance. And although Elena loved her more than anything in the world, Grace sometimes needed something her mother did not know how to give her: freedom. That morning, Elena had brought Grace to the cafe because Grace had asked for pancakes. It was supposed to be a simple mother-daughter breakfast before Elena had to attend a business meeting later that afternoon. Elena had spent most of the car ride answering emails on her phone. She was already thinking about a contract negotiation, a board presentation, and a difficult investor. Grace watched the world outside the window and quietly hummed to herself. She had learned not to interrupt her mother when she was working. Inside the cafe, Elena chose a table near the back. She helped Grace position her wheelchair comfortably and placed a menu in front of her. Then her phone buzzed again. Elena looked at the screen, sighed, and answered. She turned slightly away from Grace while speaking to one of her executives. Grace looked around the cafe. She watched families laughing together, friends sharing pastries, couples talking across small tables, and children showing their parents things on their phones. Then her eyes landed on Marcus. Something about him caught her attention. Maybe it was the way he was sitting alone. Maybe it was the sadness in his face. Or perhaps it was the small photograph sticking out of his wallet on the table. Grace could not see the picture clearly, but she noticed that it appeared to be of a little girl around her age. Marcus had taken it out earlier without realizing it and had placed it beside his coffee. Grace stared for several seconds. Then she turned her wheelchair slightly. Elena was still on the phone. Grace looked at Marcus again. Then she slowly pushed herself toward his table. Elena did not notice at first. Grace stopped a few feet away from Marcus. He looked up, surprised. The little girl smiled at him. Marcus smiled back automatically. He had always had a weakness for children. Perhaps because every child reminded him of Sophie. Grace looked at the empty chair across from him, then back at Marcus. Her voice was soft when she finally asked, "Can we join you?" Marcus froze. For a moment, he thought he had misunderstood her. He glanced around the cafe as if she might be speaking to someone else. But there was no one behind him. The little girl was looking directly at him. Marcus leaned forward slightly and smiled. "Of course," he said. "You can sit here." Grace turned her wheelchair toward the table. That was when Elena finally noticed. Her face changed instantly. "Grace," she said, trying to keep her voice calm, "what are you doing?" Grace looked at her mother and smiled. "I asked if we could sit with him." Elena looked at Marcus. Marcus immediately stood. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean." But before he could finish, Grace interrupted. "Mom, he looks lonely." The words struck Elena harder than she expected. Marcus looked down. For a few seconds, nobody spoke. Then Marcus looked at Grace and said, "Your mom is probably busy. You should go back to your table." Grace shook her head. "You look like you need someone to talk to." Marcus almost laughed, but there was sadness behind his smile. "I probably do." Elena was embarrassed. "I'm so sorry." She sometimes speaks to people without thinking. Marcus looked at her and said, "Please don't apologize. She didn't do anything wrong." Grace looked between them and said, "So, can we?" Elena wanted to say no. She had taught Grace never to approach strangers. She had taught her to be careful. She had spent years protecting her from the world because she knew how quickly people could judge someone who was different. But there was something in Grace's face that stopped her. Elena looked at Marcus. Marcus pulled out the chair beside him and said, "There's plenty of room." Elena hesitated. Then she nodded. They joined him. What happened next was not what anyone expected. Grace began talking immediately. She told Marcus about her favorite books, her school, the teacher who always made funny faces when she was surprised, and the fact that she wanted to become an architect someday because she loved drawing buildings. Marcus listened with genuine interest. He did not look at her wheelchair while she spoke. He looked at her face. When she showed him a drawing on her tablet, he asked questions about it. When she explained why she had designed a house with a huge garden, he smiled and said it sounded like a wonderful place. Elena watched quietly. She realized something uncomfortable. Marcus was speaking to Grace as if her wheelchair was not the most important thing about her. That was rare. Too rare. Doctors spoke about Grace's condition. Teachers spoke about accommodations. Therapists spoke about progress. Strangers spoke to Elena instead of Grace when asking questions. Even well-meaning people sometimes looked at the wheelchair before they looked at her daughter's face. Marcus simply saw a little girl. Then Grace noticed the photograph on the table. "Is that your daughter?" she asked. Marcus looked at the photograph. His expression changed. "Yes," he said softly. "Her name is Sophie." "Is she 7? "No. She's 9. "Where is she?" Marcus swallowed. "With my sister today." "Does she like pancakes?" Marcus smiled. "She loves them." Grace smiled, too. "I love pancakes." For the first time that morning, Marcus laughed. It was a quiet laugh, but it was real. Elena noticed. She had not seen Grace make a stranger laugh like that in a long time. Then Grace asked the question that changed everything. "Where is Sophie's mom?" Marcus's smile disappeared. Elena immediately knew the question had gone too far. "Grace," she whispered. But Marcus did not get angry. He looked at the little girl and said, "Her mom passed away." Grace became very quiet. "I'm sorry," she said. Marcus nodded. "Thank you. Do you miss her?" Elena held her breath. Marcus looked through the cafe window for several seconds. Every day. Grace reached across the table and gently placed her small hand over his. Marcus looked down at it. No one had touched his hand like that in years. Not because people did not care, but because grief made people uncomfortable. Friends had stopped mentioning his wife after the first year. Co-workers avoided the subject. Even family members learned to change the conversation when they saw his eyes become distant. But this little girl did not know that grief was supposed to be complicated. She simply knew that someone was hurting. Marcus closed his hand gently around hers. "Thank you," he whispered. Elena watched the scene and something inside her shifted. She had spent years building a life where nobody could hurt her. Yet here was a stranger sitting with her daughter, sharing a wound he had not been required to share. Then Grace asked another question. "Are you a good dad?" Marcus smiled. "I try to be." Do you make pancakes? Every Sunday. Grace looked at Elena with excitement. Mom, can you teach us? Elena almost smiled. Then her phone rang. She looked at the screen. Her business life was calling her back. The moment was over. Or at least she thought it was. Marcus stood and reached for his wallet. Grace looked disappointed. Are you leaving? Marcus nodded. I have to pick up my daughter soon. Grace looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, maybe we can see you again. Marcus smiled. Maybe. Elena expected that to be the end of it. But as Marcus walked away, Grace called after him. Wait. Marcus turned. Grace smiled. Your answer. Marcus looked confused. To what? When I asked if we could join you. Marcus laughed softly. I said yes. Grace shook her head. No. I mean, why did you say yes? Marcus looked at her for a moment. Then he said, because sometimes people don't ask to sit with you because they need a chair. Sometimes they ask because they need to know someone will make room for them. Elena froze. The words were simple. But they stayed with her. Marcus left the cafe. Grace watched him through the window until he disappeared into the crowd. Elena looked at her daughter. What made you go over there? Grace shrugged. He looked lonely. Elena sat beside her. And you weren't afraid? No. Why would I be? Grace looked toward the door. Because he looked like Dad in the picture. Elena's heart tightened. She knew Grace was talking about her father. Grace had never met him. He had died before she was born. But Elena had kept an old photograph of him. For years, she had told Grace stories about the kind of man he had been. A man who believed everyone deserved a place at the table. A man who once told Elena that money meant nothing if you had nobody to share it with. A man who had died unexpectedly before he could meet his daughter. Elena had buried that part of her life so deeply that she rarely allowed herself to think about it. Until now. That evening, Elena sat alone in her apartment after Grace had fallen asleep. The city lights stretched across the windows, reflecting against the glass like distant stars. Her laptop was open on the dining table, filled with emails and financial reports, but she could not concentrate. She kept thinking about Marcus. Not because she was attracted to him. Not yet. She was thinking about the way he had spoken to Grace. She was thinking about the way he had said that people sometimes ask to sit with you because they need to know someone will make room for them. Then she thought about her own life. Her company had hundreds of employees. Her calendar was full. Her phone never stopped ringing. Her bank account was more than comfortable. Yet she could not remember the last time someone had simply asked her if she was okay. She looked toward Grace's bedroom. For years, she had told herself that giving Grace everything was the same as giving her happiness. But perhaps it wasn't. Perhaps Grace did not need a mother who could solve every problem. Perhaps she needed a mother who could sit beside her without checking her phone. The next morning, Elena made a decision. She would find Marcus. She had no intention of invading his life. She simply wanted to thank him. But finding an ordinary man in a city of millions was harder than she expected. Then she remembered the name on the photograph. Sophie Reed. That was enough for her assistant to locate a public record connected to a school charity event. Elena found Marcus's name. She found his old workplace. She discovered that he had recently applied for several management positions. And then she saw something that made her stop. His resume. It was excellent. Years of experience. Strong recommendations. Successful projects. Leadership skills. But there was a gap. A large gap. The years after his wife's death. Elena understood immediately why companies might hesitate. They saw a gap. She saw a father who had chosen his daughter. For the first time in years, Elena used her influence for something that had nothing to do with business. She contacted a company where she knew the hiring director. She did not ask them to hire Marcus. She simply asked them to look at his resume again. The company did. Marcus got an interview. He had no idea why. 2 days later, he received an offer. It was not from Elena's company. It was from a respected firm that needed exactly the kind of experience he had. Marcus stared at the offer letter for several minutes. Then he called his sister. "I got the job," he said. His voice broke. His sister started crying. Marcus laughed through his tears. For the first time in years, he felt like maybe life was finally giving him something back. But Elena did not tell him what she had done. She did not want gratitude. She wanted him to believe he had earned it. Weeks passed. Marcus started his new job. His confidence slowly returned. He began taking Sophie to the park again. He started cooking better meals. He even bought a small table for their apartment because Sophie had always complained that they ate dinner on the couch. Life did not suddenly become perfect. There were still bills. There were still difficult nights. There were still moments when Marcus missed his wife so deeply that the apartment felt unbearably quiet. But something had changed. He no longer felt trapped. And then one Friday afternoon, he received a message. It was from Elena. She asked if he would be willing to meet for coffee. Marcus stared at the message. He smiled. Then he replied, yes. They met at the same cafe. This time, Grace was already there. She had been waiting with excitement. When Marcus entered, Grace smiled so widely that he could not help laughing. Mr. Marcus. Marcus sat beside her. Elena watched them. There was something different about the way Marcus looked at her now. Not fear. Not awkwardness. Respect. They talked for nearly 2 hours. Marcus told Elena about his new job. Elena told him about the pressure of running her company. For the first time, she admitted that she was tired. Not physically. Emotionally. She admitted that she had spent years believing that if she stayed strong enough, nothing could break her. Marcus listened. Then he said, "You don't always have to be strong." Elena looked away. Nobody had said that to her in years. Maybe nobody had ever said it at all. Their friendship grew slowly. There was no instant romance. No dramatic transformation. Just small moments. Coffee. Conversations. Grace's drawings. Sophie's pancakes. Weekend walks. Marcus taught Grace how to make pancakes from scratch. Elena laughed when Grace covered the kitchen counter in flour. Sophie became fascinated by Elena's business stories and started asking questions about how companies worked. The four of them began to feel like something none of them had planned. Something fragile. Something real. But just when life seemed to be settling into a new rhythm, a problem appeared. Elena's company entered a difficult financial period. A major investor threatened to withdraw. The board blamed Elena. Some executives argued that she was distracted. Someone even suggested that her relationship with Marcus was damaging her professional image. Elena reacted by doing what she had always done. She pushed everyone away. She stopped answering Marcus's calls. She canceled plans. She became distant with Grace. Marcus understood that she was struggling, but he did not chase her. He waited. Until one evening, Grace arrived at Marcus's apartment crying. Her mother had been working late again. Grace had overheard adults arguing about the company. She was afraid. Marcus knelt beside her. What happened? Grace wiped her tears. Mom thinks she has to do everything alone. Marcus looked at her. She doesn't. I told her that. What did she say? She said she doesn't have a choice. Marcus was silent. He understood Elena better than she realized. The woman who had built everything alone was now terrified of needing anyone. So Marcus went to her office. He found Elena standing in front of a wall of glass, looking down at the city. "You shouldn't be here," she said. "I know. I have a board meeting tomorrow. I know. My company might collapse. I know. I can't deal with anything else." Marcus nodded. "Then don't." Elena turned toward him. He continued, "You don't have to deal with me. You don't have to deal with us. You don't even have to pretend you're okay. But don't convince yourself that being alone is the same thing as being strong." Elena's eyes filled with tears. Marcus stepped closer. "Your daughter didn't ask me to fix you," he said. "She only asked if there was room at my table." Elena covered her mouth. For a moment, she looked like the powerful CEO everyone knew. Then the mask disappeared. She cried. Not quietly. Not gracefully. She cried like someone who had been holding everything inside for too long. Marcus did not try to stop her. He simply stayed. Sometimes love begins that way. Not with grand promises. Not with perfect timing. But with someone refusing to leave when you finally allow yourself to fall apart. The next morning, Elena walked into the boardroom differently. She did not pretend she had all the answers. She admitted the company's mistakes. She presented a recovery plan. She asked her team for help. And something unexpected happened. They helped. The company survived. Not because Elena became stronger, but because she finally understood that strength did not mean carrying everything alone. Months later, the same cafe where Grace had first asked Marcus if they could join him hosted a small celebration. Sophie had turned 10. Grace had completed a major school project. Marcus had been promoted at his new company. Elena's business had recovered. The four of them sat around a table near the window. Grace looked at Marcus and smiled. "Do you remember when I asked you if we could join you?" Marcus laughed. "I remember. You looked really sad." "I was. Are you sad now?" Marcus looked across the table. At Sophie. At Grace. At Elena. He smiled. "No." Grace nodded as if she had expected that answer. Then she said something that made everyone quiet. "I think Dad would have liked you." Elena looked down. She knew Grace was talking about the father she had never met. Marcus looked at Elena. Elena reached across the table and held Grace's hand. Sophie smiled. For a moment, nobody spoke. Outside, sunlight poured through the windows. The cafe was busy. People came and went. Nobody around them knew how much had changed because of one little question. Nobody knew that a lonely man had once been sitting at that table wondering whether his life was over. Nobody knew that a powerful woman had once believed she had to carry the world alone. Nobody knew that a little girl in a wheelchair had seen sadness in a stranger's eyes and decided that he should not have to sit alone. But they knew. And that was enough. 1 year later, Marcus and Elena returned to the same cafe. This time, they arrived together. Grace was still using her wheelchair, but she had become more confident than ever. Sophie pushed the door open for her, laughing as Grace complained that she could do it herself. Marcus carried a small gift bag. Elena held 2 cups of coffee. They sat at the same table. The same table where everything had begun. Grace looked at Marcus. "Can we join you?" Marcus smiled. "You already did." Everyone laughed. Elena looked around the cafe and realized that sometimes the greatest moments in life arrive disguised as interruptions. A child asking a stranger a question. A lonely father answering. A mother allowing herself to trust someone. A family forming without anyone planning it. Marcus had once believed his life had ended the day he lost his wife. Elena had once believed her life had to be controlled perfectly to keep Grace safe. Grace had taught them both something neither success nor money could teach. You cannot always choose what happens to you. But you can choose whether you make room for someone else. And sometimes, making room for one person creates space for an entire new life. If this story touched your heart, please don't just scroll away. Take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who needs a reminder that kindness still matters, and subscribe to Second Chance Stories for more stories about love, family, second chances, and the unexpected people who change our lives. And before we end, I want to ask you something special. If you believe that one small act of kindness can change someone's entire life, comment "Make room for kindness" below. Let that be your reminder that no matter how difficult life becomes, there is always room at the table for one more person. Because in the end, Grace never really asked Marcus, "Can we join you?" She was asking something much bigger. Can we sit beside you when you're lonely? Can we remind you that you're not forgotten? Can we become part of your story? And Marcus's answer was simple. Yes. There will always be room. Sometimes, that is all a broken heart needs to hear.